Now we're going to get into puberty. We'll go over the basics of what puberty is, and then get into risk factors for excess weight gain related to puberty, as well as insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So, puberty is the physical maturation resulting in the ability to reproduce through sexual reproduction. And in humans, it results in what are called secondary sex characteristics. These are things like menstruation, voice changes, and breast and testicle development. They're secondary sex characteristics because these already exist, but then they secondarily develop during puberty. And this is initiated via endocrine signals that are nutritionally related. So really briefly, how do we measure puberty? We use what's called the Tanner Staging Scale, or Sexual Maturity Rating. This was developed in 1969, and it is a scale that is based on the physical representation of secondary sex characteristics. So that is things that are sexually dimorphic characteristics that are not directly involved in reproduction. So things like body hair, breast tissue development, and testicle volume. It's important to note that these aren't necessarily related to age, although they do tend to occur during similar age periods. So let's look at the pubertal sequence. We'll start with telarchy, which is primarily in girls, go to pubarchy, adrenarchy, and then menarche or spermarchy. So overall, we see that pubertal development is related to height and age. So we see, and this blue line is boys, green line is girls, that it takes place over a long period of time. This one is 9 years, but there is some data showing that it can go all the way to 25. So around 10, we see the beginning of breast budding and pubic hair. You'll notice that the girls begin to develop before the boys. A little bit later, we see the boys' development starts. Around the age of 13, we see kind of the highlight of puberty for girls, which is menarche. And then it's really until almost 18 years old, though, that we see adult ovulation. And PHV, just for note, this is peak height velocity. So this is when you reach your maximum height growth. So you see that this is, if we were to do some fancy calculus and take the tangent of this line, it would be the steepest right here. And then it starts to get slower, and then we reach our maximum height. So we see that girls hit their peak height velocity much earlier. Boys tend to become taller a little bit later. So telarchy is the onset of secondary breast development, often called breast budding. It begins between 8 and 13 years, although this is highly variable. And it takes around 3 to 4 years for full breast development to occur, although even this is highly variable. So our initial breast development actually occurs as a fetus. Again, this is a secondary sex characteristic, so everything that is important already is there. It just develops later. And puberty is considered delayed if telarchy doesn't occur before 13 years. Now, this might not be a bad thing, it's just considered delayed. And that may mean that a pediatrician checks in a little bit more, It may mean that the child is underweight, or it could just be a natural difference. There's also premature telarchy, which is when the development of breast buds occurs before the age of 8 years without any other pubertal changes. And this is more common than you would think. And this particularly happens in kids that are around 2 years of age. They may have some what would be considered breast development, but it actually will wax and wane. So it'll increase and then it'll decrease, and then it generally will even back out around the age of puberty. So pubarchy is the first appearance of pubic hair, and this is generally between 10 to 12 years of age. And this can occur independently of the other pubertal stages, although it's usually after telarchy. So if we look at our Tanner stages, in the prepubertal stage, we see no pubic hair. In Tanner stage 2, we see some sparse, fine, straight, downy hair. It isn't until stage 3 that we start to see the appearance of terminal hair, which would be more like adult pubic hair. And then finally, we see that it starts kind of spreading out, developing further. So, along with telarchy and pubarchy, we have adrenarchy, and this is related to the adrenal cortex. So recall that the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney, and it's made up of a bunch of layers. It has a cortex, which is the top part, and a medulla, which is the bottom part. We're not going to talk about the medulla right now. We're going to focus on the cortex, because that's where we have 3 zones. The zona glomerulosa, the zona vestibulata, and the zona reticularis. And the adrenal glands produce androgen hormones. They produce DHEA, DHEA sulfate, and androstenedione. And it is the development of the zona reticularis in particular that drives adrenarchy. And this is the innermost zone of the adrenal cortex. So adrenarchy takes a long time. You'll see that if we just plot the levels of DHEAS, which is the sulfate version, we see that it actually peaks after 20 years of age. But we see very, very rapid development around the age that we would generally consider puberty, which is this purplish line. It's after this that we see then the sexual differentiation. So we see that DHEA, which is an androgen, continues to increase in people born male, and it tends to taper off or decrease in people born female. And this happens around, we'll say, age 16. So it's this development of the adrenal glands that increases pubic hair, body odor, skin oiliness, which I'm sure were our favorite parts of puberty, but also sexual attraction and libido, as well as acne. So if we look at the adrenal androgens, like I mentioned, we have DHEA, and DHEA is a pre-testosterone. It gets converted into testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, which you may have heard of as like super testosterone, at the level of the skin and hair follicle. But it can also be converted into estradiol, one of the estrogens in the vagina. Additionally, it has nervous system effects. It has been shown to increase aggression. And so here, you don't need to know these levels, but what I want you to notice are the levels um, from puberty and pre-puberty through adolescence and the pubertal stages. So we see that they go from either 11 to maybe under 200 in pre-puberty, all the way to 400 during late puberty. So that's a 400% increase. And similarly, they can reach very high levels in girls as well, even as high as 700. So DHEAS is very similar to DHEA. It's just a sulfate has been added, and it can actually change back and forth between DHEA and DHEAS. And so again, you don't have to know these limits. I just want you to notice how much they increase over the course of puberty in both males and females. An androstenedione is an intermediate between DHEA and testosterone and estrogen, and you may actually have seen this sold as a dietary supplement, although it's currently banned through the World Anti-Doping Agency and from the Olympic Games. It's also banned in the MLB, NFL, USOC, NCAA, and NBA. And as of 2004, it was banned by the FDA. If you're a baseball fan, this is one of the steroids that Mark McGwire was supplementing with. And I just want to point out, because you can still buy this online. I did a quick Google, and yep, you're able to buy DHEA and androstenedione online. But it's important to note that it does have toxic effects, particularly to the liver. It can also lead to shrunken testicles, behavior changes, particularly increased aggression, and breast development in men, as well as decreased sperm production and a risk for prostate cancer. In women, it can lead to hirsutism, which is excess and uncharacteristic facial hair patterns, enlargement of the clitoris, male pattern baldness, abnormal menstrual periods, masculine traits in general, and an increase for breast and endometrial cancer. So now we're getting to menarche. And this generally occurs between the ages of 9 and 14 years, although it can occur earlier and it can occur later. This is particularly nutritionally related. It's tightly related to body fat and therefore nutrition. In order to initiate menarche, girls need around 17% body fat. And as they continue to develop, they need to maintain around 22% body fat to maintain menarche normally. And this is because menarche is a signal that the body is becoming or gaining the ability to carry an embryo and develop that embryo into a fetus. And essentially, if we don't have at least 17% body fat, we being female, so we cannot initiate menarche because we don't have enough stored energy to maintain fetal growth. And really, we won't have enough body fat unless we have 22% body fat to maintain fetal growth. So early in life, menses does not mean that ovulation has occurred. So in the first year after menarche, 80% of the cycles are uh, anovulatory, meaning there was no egg. As females age, they tend to ovulate more regularly, but it isn't really until the 6th year that they'll start to ovulate regularly. So, considering that a girl may be 14 when she starts, it isn't until she's 20 when she's actually reproductively mature. Although that isn't to say that females can't become pregnant before this 6-year mark. Females can become pregnant even before menarche, although this is highly unlikely. And menarche is not related to sexual intercourse. This is a really unfortunate old wives' tale that by having sexual intercourse, it starts menarche, or that menarche is a sign that a girl has had sex. They're completely unrelated. So let's look specifically at nutrition now. Nutritional status is the strongest environmental factor controlling puberty. Females, like I mentioned, need increased body fat, about 22%, to support a growing fetus and for initial breastfeeding. For body fat, it's going to signal how much body fat is available through leptin. And leptin is a hormone that's secreted from white adipose tissue. It signals to the brain and body that the woman has enough extra energy to build a new human. And please note that I'm using the terms woman and female in the strictest biological sense, meaning that the person has a double X chromosome. So leptin signals through the CNS and it goes to a neuron called kisspeptin. And kisspeptin is what permits puberty. And it does this through gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. So increasingly, we're noticing changes in pubertal development due to excess weight gain. So for a long time, we focused on women who didn't have enough fat tissue to start menses. But what we're seeing is that obesity, and in particular visceral adiposity, is related to, of course, more leptin, but fat cells also have aromatase. Aromatase converts testosterone into estrogen. So the more aromatase you have, the more testosterone you're converting to estrogen. The more leptin signaling, that's going to put the OK for starting puberty and the maturation of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadotropin axis. So that's going to encourage the promotion of earlier adrenarche, pubarche, telarche, and central precocious puberty. And it does this additionally through increased androgens and estrogens. And we also see that the increased insulin release with the increased visceral adiposity also increases androgens from the ovaries, the adrenals, and it decreases sex binding hormone from the liver. Sex hormone binding globulin, or SHBG, binds to testosterone and estrogen, and it makes them inert. So with less sex hormone binding globulin, we have more free testosterone and free estrogen. So that also is going to lead to the promotion of earlier adrenarche, pubarche, telarche, and central precocious puberty. And in fact, people started to notice this around 20 years ago, that the average age of menarche in girls has been decreasing. And we generally look at menarche because it's really obvious. And most women remember their first period. If they don't remember this, probably not the exact day, but they know about how old they are or were. So here we see across a lot of different countries that the average age of menarche has been declining, meaning that girls are going through puberty at younger ages. And particularly, if we look at China, in the 70s, China was up at around 15. However, with westernization, we see that it dropped dramatically in the 1990s. So globally, the median age of menarche is 12.25 years. You may be thinking, oh, well, people are going through menarche early. Does that matter? Well, it is related to improved living conditions, so that's nice. It means that women are getting enough calories to have around 17% body fat. But unfortunately, early menarche is also related to breast cancer, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. And it's also related to a host of psychosocial elements, such as poor academic performance, substance abuse, disordered eating, and depression. So this is another graph from one of my studies that I published a couple of years ago, because I was curious about BMI and the age of onset of menses. And I looked at a really big data set called the Human Connectome Project. And first, I just looked if there was a correlation between adult BMI and self-reported age at onset of menses. And what I saw was the earlier a woman reported going through menses, the higher her body mass index. Although you will see that there's quite a bit of variation here, but overall it has a negative trend. I also looked at the brain, and what I saw was the brain is connecting differently if a woman has a high BMI with early onset of menses, in particularly between what's known as the cingulo-opercular task control network and the primary visual area. You don't have to pay attention to the cingular-opercular part. Just consider this a task control network. It's important for goal setting and planning. And what I saw was a negative relationship with the onset of menses, meaning that the connectivity between these two regions increased the connectivity. And the increased BMI was related to increased connectivity as well. And together, this suggests that the brain is exerting higher control from the task control network on the primary visual area. This could be due to a variety of factors, but it makes me think that potentially this is related to restrictive eating. So maybe something I'll look at next study. An additional risk factor, along with just excess weight gain, is parental weight status. So, parental weight status is the most robust predictor of their offspring's weight. And that's because parental weight combines genetics and environment. So, we also see behaviors differ, with increased preferences for palatable, high energy foods in children from parents with high BMIs. And what are some palatable, high energy foods we know of? Well, refined grains are a big one, but also things like milkshakes, candies. So, when I was a postdoc, we did an fMRI. Well, actually, my postdoc mentor did an fMRI paradigm where a person was sitting in a big MRI machine. They look like this kind of, and you lay in them. And in the MRI, we fed people tastes of a chocolate milkshake. You don't really need to know any of these parts. But then we also looked at maternal BMI as a risk factor for excess weight gain. And so at baseline, there's no difference between the two groups. They're the same. Their body mass indexes were around 20. But over time, what we saw, and let me actually erase these markings, is that they started exactly, well, not exactly, but they started very similar. But over time, the children of moms with higher BMIs gained more weight over 3 years. Well, actually, 4 years. And not only did they gain more weight over 4 years, so this now was significantly different, we saw changes in their brain. And if we go back here, you'll see that that scan was taken at baseline. So this is before the weight change. But the brain was already exhibiting differences to our milkshake taste versus a tasteless taste. Kids who were at high risk of obesity showed an exaggerated response in the orbital frontal cortex and in the insula. The insula is particularly interesting because this is a taste and reward area of the brain. So this indicates that this taste may be more tasty and more rewarding in kids with parents who have a higher BMI. We also saw this in another taste area, which is called the central opericulum, as well as the caudate, which is an important area for reward and motivation. So even before any weight was gained, we see differences in the brain response. And this can become even more important when we think about the insulin resistance during puberty. So all youth go through a period of insulin resistance or decreased insulin sensitivity during puberty. And we see that in this graph here, where this SI means insulin sensitivity. And the normal weight group is the circles, and the obese group is little triangles and is dashed. And we see that both groups decrease sensitivity, insulin sensitivity. But you also probably noticed that the kids with obesity start much lower. They have a lower insulin sensitivity and a lower acute response to glucose, which we see here. And what this suggests is that children with obesity are starting at a lower insulin sensitivity and may actually be exhausting their beta cells after puberty. And we'll get into type 2 diabetes and adolescence in the next video.